Chess is one of the oldest and most recognized games in the world. It is an exciting game of strategy and planning, which is why it is seen as a symbol of intelligence. However, chess is easy to learn and can be enjoyed by anyone at any level. Chess is played on an 8x8 board with 64 squares and 32 pieces, and the game is all about checkmating the king. Once the king is in checkmate, which we'll explain later, then the game is over. So to start, let's meet the king. Even though the king is the most important piece in chess, it isn't the most powerful. The king can only move one square at a time in any direction. Here are the squares where the white king can currently move. Here's one move. Now the king could move here, and here's another king move. In chess, both players have identical sets of pieces. You have a king, and so does your opponent. Each player will take turns making a move until the game is over. Now that you've learned how the king moves, it's your turn to practice moving the king. The king might be the most important piece in chess, but the queen is by far the most powerful. Like the king, the queen can move in any direction, forward, backward, to the sides, as well as diagonally. Unlike the king, the queen can move as far as she wants in any direction. The one thing the queen can't do is jump over other pieces. Let's look at some queen moves. In this position, the queen can go all the way up the diagonal. She could slide all the way across the board. She could now move all the way down here. Or she can make some shorter moves, like here, here, and here's another queen move. Earlier, we mentioned that the queen cannot jump over other pieces. In this position, let's say the queen wants to get to this square. Notice that the king is currently in the way of the queen. So the queen would have to move to another square first, and only then, on the next turn, could the queen move here. Now that you've learned how the queen moves, it's your turn to practice moving the queen. After the queen, the rook is the second most powerful piece. It can move up, down, and to the sides as far as it wants, but the rook can only move in straight lines. Like the other pieces we've looked at so far, the rook also can't jump over any other piece. Let's take a look at some rook moves. In this position, the rook could move straight up, it could slide to the corner, it could move all the way down the board, now it could swing to the other side, or it could make some shorter moves, like here and here. Now that you've learned how the rook moves, it's your turn to practice moving the rook. It's one of the most interesting pieces in chess because it can move as far as it wants, but only on diagonals. The bishop, just like the other pieces that we've met so far, cannot jump over other pieces. This means that the bishop has to stay on the same colored square it starts the game on for the entire game. In chess, you get two bishops. This bishop is called the light-squared bishop because it can only travel on the light squares. Meet the other bishop that you have in the game, the dark-squared bishop. It moves exactly like the light-squared bishop, but only on the dark-squared diagonals. Now that you've met both bishops, let's take a look at how they move. With just one move, the dark-squared bishop can enter the longest dark-squared diagonal on the board. Let's do the same with the light-squared bishop. Now, notice no matter how many bishop moves we make, the bishops never cross paths. They never block each other, and the reason why is because they're on opposite colored squares, so they never interfere with each other. They make a good team. Now that you've learned how the bishops move, it's your turn to practice moving the bishops. Perhaps the most fun piece in chess. It is the only piece in chess that does not move in some sort of straight line. It moves in a strange L shape. The other interesting thing about the knight is it's the only piece in chess that can jump over other pieces, like this. It takes a little practice to understand exactly how the knight moves. It goes two squares in one direction and then one square to the side, like this. Highlighted are all the possible squares the knight can move to on the next turn. Notice it always moves in the same pattern. Two to the side and over one, like this. Or like this. Up two and over one. Or down two and over one. And notice that the knight moves from a light square to a dark square. And then on the next turn, it moves from a dark square to a light square. The knight always switches colors with each turn it makes. Now that you've learned how the knight moves, it's your turn to practice moving this fun and tricky piece. Pawn sounds like it is the humblest of chess pieces, but it is really one of the most powerful. When working together, pawns are the soul of chess. Pawns have a few strange rules, so make sure to pay attention. Pawns can only move straight forward, and they can only move one square at a time. However, if it is their first move of the game, they can choose to move 2 squares forward if there is nobody blocking them, as pawns cannot jump over other pieces. Remember, the pawn can choose to advance 1 or 2 squares only on the first move. On all other moves, the pawn advances 1 square. Pawns are also the only piece in chess that cannot move backwards. One other thing that makes them strange is that while they can only move straight forward, pawns can only capture diagonally, and they can only capture 1 square away diagonally, even if it is their first turn. We will explain capturing in one of the next lessons. Let's see some pawn moves. In this position, since this pawn has yet to move in the game, white decides to move it 2 squares forward. Black, on the other hand, only advances this pawn 1 square. Remember, even though you can move your pawn 2 squares on its first move, you're not forced to do so. White now advances the pawn forward, and now both pawns are blocked and cannot move. In this position, how many white pawns can move? If you said 1, you're correct. Notice that this pawn is blocked by the black pawn directly in front of it. Remember, pawns cannot move backwards. White now has the option to move this pawn up 1 square. Notice this pawn cannot move 2 squares forward because the black pawn blocks it. Now it's your turn to practice using the pawns. Remember, your pawns are the only pieces that cannot move backwards, so what happens when they reach the other side of the board? They get a promotion. You must trade your pawn for another piece. It can be a knight, a bishop, a rook, or the powerful queen. It cannot stay a pawn, and it cannot become a king. Also, it does not have to be one of the pieces already captured in the game. Every pawn has the potential to be promoted into a queen. You could trade it for another queen and have 2 queens on the board, which is incredibly powerful. Now, let's practice promoting some pawns. Now that you know how the chess pieces move, it's time to set up the game. Before you put the pieces on, make sure you turn the chessboard so that there's a light square in the bottom right corner. You can remember this as white on the right. The easiest way to start placing the pieces is to place all of the pawns on the second rank for each side. In chess, rank is the word for row. Let's put all of the white pawns on one side of the board and all of the black pawns on the other side. Now let's put the rooks out in the corners. Let's follow that up by putting the knights next to the rooks. We'll soon learn that the knights are placed on the B and G files. In chess, file is the word for column. To continue, let's put the bishops next to the knights. And now we're left with the king and the queen. Does it matter where they go? Yes, it does. The queen always goes on the matching square. The white queen goes on the light square, and the black queen goes on the dark square. Notice they should be lined up together. Finally, put the kings on the last empty squares. Now you're ready to play. In chess, each side takes only 1 turn at a time, and by tradition, white always moves first. Now that the board is set up, it's your turn to practice making moves for both sides.